The porch light at the old lakeside house flickered once, twice, and then held steady, throwing a pale yellow circle across the weathered boards. And Luke Harrison stood inside that circle, holding a cardboard package, with someone else's name printed on the label, his heart going harder than it had any right to, for something this small. The door opened before he could knock a second time. A woman stood there in a gray cardigan, her hair pulled back loose, her eyes the kind of tired that came from years, not days. And when she saw his face, really saw it, something in her posture folded inward, like a held breath finally let go. She looked at the package in his hands, then at him, and she said it quietly, almost to herself, the words landing soft and strange in the cold mountain air. "I hoped you wouldn't listen." A dish towel, forgotten in her other hand, slipped from her fingers and fell to the porch boards between them, and neither of them moved to pick it up. To find out who Hannah Reynolds really was, and why an entire town had spent weeks warning Luke Harrison to stay away from her door, stay until the very end. If stories like this speak to you, about the people we misjudge before we ever really know them, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. So many of you watching have lived some version of this yourselves, and this is a place for those stories. There's an old argument that never quite dies in small towns like this one. Whether a person who stays silent for years, letting the whole world believe the worst of them, was protecting something worth protecting, or simply too afraid to speak. Keep that question in your mind. It matters more than it seems right now. 3 years ago, none of this existed. Not the house on the lake, not the town, not the quiet arrangement Luke Harrison had built his whole life around since his wife Diane passed. 3 years ago, Luke was still living in the city, working long shifts as a facilities inspector for a mid-sized property management company, coming home to an apartment that echoed too much, and doing his best to be enough for his daughter Chloe, who was 5 then, and who still sometimes cried out for her mother in the middle of the night without fully understanding why. Luke never remarried, never really tried. He worked with his hands and his eyes, checking boilers and wiring and load-bearing walls in buildings nobody else wanted to climb into, and he did it quietly, without complaint, because complaint had never gotten him anywhere, and because Chloe was watching him more closely than he sometimes remembered. By the time Chloe turned 8, Luke had saved enough, sold enough, and simplified his life enough to make the move he'd been circling for 2 years. North, into the mountains, to a small town called Millbrook Hollow, where the pace of life ran slower and the rent ran lower, and a man could raise his daughter somewhere the sky was visible at night. He found a modest 2-bedroom rental 3 streets back from Maine, took a job doing seasonal maintenance and light contracting for the town's rental properties, and told himself, and Chloe, that this was where they would finally stop moving. It didn't take long for Luke to hear about the house on the lake. It sat at the end of a gravel road that most people in Millbrook Hollow avoided, without ever quite saying why. A 2-story clapboard house with green shutters and an overgrown garden that had clearly once been someone's pride. The woman who lived there, people said, kept to herself in a way that went past ordinary privacy into something people whispered about at the diner and the hardware store and the little post office where Luke picked up his mail. Her name was Hannah Reynolds. Some said she'd had a breakdown years back. Some said worse, that something had happened out at that house, something nobody wanted to name directly, and that she wasn't quite right anymore, not since. The postmaster, a heavy-set man named Earl, who ran the counter like it was a courtroom, told Luke plainly the first week he moved in, "Don't go out to the lake house. Woman doesn't want visitors, and folks around here respect that." Luke, a man who preferred to draw his own conclusions, only nodded, filed it away, and thought little more of it, until the package. It arrived at his rental by mistake on a gray Tuesday afternoon in early October, addressed to H. Reynolds, Lake Road, but delivered instead to L. Harrison, 3 streets back from Maine, because some clerk somewhere had transposed 2 digits on a route sheet. Luke turned it over in his hands at the kitchen table that evening. Chloe doing homework across from him, and he thought about mailing it back, thought about dropping it at the post office, and letting Earl deal with it. But something about the weight of it, light and oddly careful, made him decide to just drive it out himself. Chloe insisted on coming. She was at the age where every unfamiliar place felt like the beginning of an adventure. and she chattered the whole ride out about a book she was reading for school. Unbothered by the gravel road narrowing, unbothered by the lake appearing gray and still through the trees, unbothered in the particular way that children are unbothered by things adults have decided to be afraid of. Luke parked at the end of the drive and climbed the porch steps alone, telling Chloe to wait in the truck, and knocked twice on a door that hadn't seen fresh paint in years. He heard footsteps, slow and uneven, on the other side. And when the door opened, and Hannah Reynolds looked at the package in his hands, and then at his face, she said the words that would follow him for months afterward. "I hoped you wouldn't listen." And it would take Luke a long time to understand exactly what she meant by them, and longer still to understand why they weren't a warning at all, but something closer to relief. That first meeting lasted less than 4 minutes. Hannah took the package, thanked him with a voice that seemed unused to speaking, and started to close the door, but stopped when Chloe's small voice called out from the truck window, cheerful and unafraid, asking if the lady liked to paint, because there was an easel visible through the front window, half turned toward the glass. Hannah's eyes moved past Luke to the child in the truck, and something crossed her face that Luke couldn't name yet, but would come to recognize later as the first crack in a wall that had been standing for a very long time. 8 months would pass before that crack widened enough for either of them to see all the way through it. But the first Tuesday afternoon, Chloe asked to go back to the painting lady's house was closer than either of them knew. The trouble started, as trouble in small towns often does, with a version of the truth that had grown teeth over time. Luke didn't chase gossip, but gossip in Millbrook Hollow had a way of finding a man whether he went looking for it or not, and by his second month in town he had pieced together enough fragments to understand that Hannah Reynolds had once been someone entirely different. A pediatric surgeon, some said, though nobody seemed certain where, with a promising career and a life full of noise and purpose, until a car accident on a rain-slicked mountain road took her younger sister Mara, and left Hannah alive in a hospital bed for 6 weeks, the only survivor of a crash that should have taken her too. After that, the story went, she came home to the lake house their grandparents had left them both, and she never really left it again. Luke didn't repeat any of it, not to Chloe, not to anyone at the hardware store where he picked up brackets for a shelving job. But he thought about it more than he expected to, mostly because Chloe had, without asking his permission first, started asking to go back. It began small. A drawing Chloe wanted to give the painting lady dropped off on the porch without a knock, because Chloe was shy about approaching directly. Then a wave through the truck window that Hannah, standing at her garden gate one Tuesday, returned before she seemed to decide whether she meant to. Then, 3 weeks after the package, an actual invitation, Hannah at the end of her drive as Luke and Chloe passed on a walk, saying awkwardly that she had extra art supplies if Chloe ever wanted to use them, and that Luke was welcome to stay or go, whichever he preferred. Luke chose to stay the first few times. He sat in Hannah's kitchen with a cup of coffee he barely touched, watching through the doorway as his daughter and a woman the whole town called dangerous bent over a shared canvas, Hannah's hands guiding Chloe's without ever taking the brush away from her. He noticed things in that kitchen the way he noticed load-bearing cracks in old buildings, small signs of long neglect that spoke to something deeper than surface wear. A calendar on the wall stopped on a month from 4 years back. A second toothbrush still sitting in a cup by the bathroom sink, untouched, unmoved. A framed photograph, face down on a side table, that Hannah never turned upright while anyone else was in the room. The breaking point, when it came, wasn't dramatic in the way Luke might have expected. It came from Earl at the post office, in front of half a dozen people waiting in line on a Saturday morning. "Heard your girl's been going out to the lake house," Earl said, not unkindly exactly, but loud enough for the whole room. "You ought to think twice about that, Luke. That woman's not stable. Everybody knows it. You're new here, you don't know the history. But folks around here have kept their distance from that house for a reason, and there's talk now that maybe you ought to, too, for the kid's sake, if nothing else." Luke said nothing in response, which was its own kind of statement, the kind that people in small towns tend to read as agreement even when it isn't. He collected his mail and left, and by that evening 3 separate people, a neighbor, the woman who ran the diner, and Chloe's own second-grade teacher, stopping him outside the school the following Monday, had found some version of the same conversation to have with him, each one gentler than Earl's but carrying the identical undertone, that a good father wouldn't let his daughter near a woman like that. He didn't stop the visits, not right away, but he pulled back. Fewer afternoons, shorter ones, an excuse here and there about homework or errands. Enough that Chloe noticed, enough that she asked him one evening, with the direct, unguarded honesty only a child can manage, why they didn't go see Hannah anymore, and whether Hannah was in trouble, and whether it was Luke's fault. He didn't have a good answer for her. That was the part that stayed with him longest. Not the town's warnings, not Earl's lecture, but the fact that his own daughter's simple, unclouded affection for a woman he barely knew had exposed something in him that he didn't like looking at directly, that he had let a room full of people who knew nothing decide. For him, who was safe to love and who wasn't. The final visit, before the pulling away became a full stop, happened on a gray afternoon in late November. Luke dropped Chloe off at the end of the drive, telling himself he'd be back in an hour, and when he returned, he found Hannah standing alone at her gate, Chloe already inside doing homework at the kitchen table, and Hannah's face carrying an expression Luke hadn't seen on her before. Something braced, something ready to be told to stay away, before he'd said a single word. "You don't have to bring her back," Hannah said quietly, looking past him toward the truck instead of at him directly. "I know what people say. I know what it cost you, being seen coming out here. I'd rather she just stop than have you resent bringing her." Luke stood there a long moment, the same stubborn instinct in him that had once made him climb into condemned buildings other inspectors refused, telling him that the fastest way to make a wrong thing right was rarely the loudest way. But he didn't say any of that yet. He only told her he'd think about it, loaded Chloe into the truck, and drove home with his daughter's disappointed silence, filling the cab the whole way. 1 month later, an ordinary Thursday afternoon would change everything neither of them had said out loud yet. Because that was the day Luke finally asked the question everyone in town had been too afraid, or too unkind, to ask Hannah Reynolds directly. December in Millbrook Hollow arrived early and heavy, snow settling into the valley by the first week and staying, and Luke found that the cold gave him an excuse he hadn't realized he needed. A reason to drive out to the lake house on the pretense of checking that Hannah's woodpile was stocked, since he did similar work for half the rental properties in town anyway, and no one could accuse a man of impropriety for stacking firewood. Hannah let him. That in itself told him something. It was on the third of these visits, the two of them stacking split logs against the side of the house while Chloe built a lopsided snowman near the porch, that Luke finally asked the question he'd been circling for weeks. He didn't ask about the accident, or Mara, or any of the fragments the town had handed him. He asked, instead, something simpler. "Why do you stay out here alone if it isn't what you want?" Hannah didn't answer right away. She set down the log in her hands, looked out at the frozen lake for a long moment, and then told him, not the whole of it, not yet, but enough, that she had been a pediatric surgeon in the city, that she had been good at it, maybe even excellent, that she had built a life around the particular high-wire feeling of holding a child's life steady under her hands and winning, more often than she lost. And that 4 years ago, driving her younger sister Mara home from a weekend at their grandparents' old lake house, a truck had crossed the center line on a rain-slicked curve, and Hannah had walked away with a shattered collarbone and 11 stitches, and Mara had not walked away at all. "I operated on children for a living," Hannah said, her voice flat, in the particular way people's voices go flat when they've told themselves a story. So many times it no longer feels like it's happening to them. I was good at keeping people alive, and I couldn't keep the one person who mattered most alive for 11 miles on a road I'd driven 100 times. She didn't cry saying it. That, Luke thought later, was somehow harder to witness than if she had. She told him the rest in pieces over that winter, how she'd stopped operating within 6 months, how her hands had started shaking in ways that made the decision for her before she was ready to make it herself, how she'd moved into her grandparents' house because it was the last place that still felt like Mara, and how she had let the town's stories about her grow unchecked because correcting them would have required talking about Mara at all, and for a long time she hadn't been able to. Here is a question worth sitting with, the kind that splits a room straight down the middle. Was Hannah Reynolds a coward for letting a whole town believe the worst of her rather than speak one difficult truth aloud? Or was her silence simply the only shape grief was willing to take? People who've never carried grief like that tend to answer quickly. People who have tend to answer slower, if they answer at all. It was Marisol Vega, Hannah's oldest friend from medical school, and one of the only people from Hannah's old life who still called, who became the unexpected evidence finder in all of this. She'd been visiting Millbrook Hollow twice a year since the accident, quietly, without the town's knowledge, and it was Marisol who told Luke, carefully, over coffee at the diner one afternoon when their paths happened to cross. The parts of Hannah's story that Hannah herself hadn't yet been ready to share, that Hannah had, in fact, quietly funded 3 separate scholarship programs for pediatric surgical residents in Mara's name, entirely anonymously, still doing good in the only way she could stomach doing it, from a distance, without her name attached. That the instability the town whispered about had, as far as Marisol knew, amounted to exactly one incident, a panic attack in a grocery store 2 years back, that a frightened cashier had exaggerated into legend by the time it finished circulating. She's not dangerous, Marisol told Luke plainly. She's just tired of being underestimated by people who decided who she was before they ever asked her. The secondary crisis arrived just after New Year's, when Chloe, playing near the frozen edge of the lake against Luke's explicit instructions, slipped through a thin patch of ice into water that came up to her chest, the cold hitting her hard enough that she couldn't find her voice to scream. It was Hannah, closest enough to hear the splash, fast enough despite years away from any hospital, who pulled Chloe out, wrapped her in blankets, and, in the same steady hands that had once held children's lives together on an operating table, checked her breathing, her pulse, her color, calling out clear instructions to Luke the entire time, until Chloe was warm, safe, and laughing again within the hour, more shaken than hurt. Luke stood in Hannah's kitchen that evening, watching her make his daughter hot chocolate with hands that had 20 minutes earlier moved with a competence no maintenance job, no small-town suspicion could ever have prepared him to witness, and he understood all at once exactly how badly Millbrook Hollow had gotten this woman wrong. 2 months later, on an early March afternoon that neither of them saw coming, the rest of the truth would surface in front of the one person whose opinion Hannah had spent 4 years bracing against, and the reckoning that followed would change more than just her standing in. The town's opinion of Hannah Reynolds might have gone on unchanged indefinitely if not for what happened at the Millbrook Hollow Elementary Spring Benefit, an event Luke had only agreed to attend because Chloe's class was performing a short program, and because, 6 months into knowing her, he'd finally convinced Hannah to come too, arguing, correctly, as it turned out, that hiding from a room full of people who'd already decided their story about her had never once made that story less wrong. It was there, in the gymnasium strung with paper lanterns, that 8-year-old Tommy Averill, son of the diner's owner, collapsed mid-performance, his lips going faintly blue, his breathing shallow and wrong in a way that sent the room into the particular silent panic that follows a child in visible distress. Parents froze. Someone called for the school nurse, who was 3 towns over that weekend covering another district's event, and in the space where nobody else moved, Hannah Reynolds was already on her knees beside him, her hands moving with an authority that silenced the room faster than any shouted instruction could have. Assessing his airway, recognizing within seconds what was happening, calling out for someone to bring her the boy's backpack, where his rescue inhaler, unused and forgotten in a side pocket for weeks, was finally located and administered. Tommy's breathing steadied within 90 seconds. The ambulance, called as a precaution, arrived to find a stable child and a room full of adults staring at Hannah Reynolds as though seeing her for the first time. Because, in the way that mattered, they were. It was Tommy's mother, Rosalind Averill, who broke the silence that followed, her voice cracking as she asked, disbelieving how Hannah had known exactly what to do, exactly what to look for, faster than anyone else in a room full of parents. And it was Marisol Vega, standing near the back of the gymnasium, who finally said aloud what she'd been carrying quietly for 4 years, that the woman kneeling on the gymnasium floor had once been one of the most respected pediatric surgeons in the state, that she had saved more children's lives than anyone in that room could count, and that the story the town had told itself about her had been wrong from the very beginning. The room's reaction wasn't instant redemption. Small towns rarely offer that cleanly. There was a long, uncomfortable pause, the kind where people's faces cycle visibly through disbelief, embarrassment, and the particular discomfort of realizing they've spent months being unkind to someone who didn't deserve it. Earl, the postmaster standing near the punch bowl, was among the first to look away, unable to meet Hannah's eyes. It was here, in that same gymnasium, that the second controversy running quietly beneath the whole story finally surfaced in the open. The question of whether Hannah should have simply told people the truth months earlier, corrected the record herself, defended her own name, rather than letting a town's cruel version of her stand unchallenged for years. Some in that gymnasium would say later that her silence had been its own kind of failure, that speaking up sooner might have spared her the isolation entirely. Others would say the opposite, that a woman grieving her sister owed no one an explanation for how she chose to survive it, and that the real failure belonged to a town too quick to fill an information vacuum with the worst possible story. Both sides had a point. Neither was entirely wrong. What mattered more, in the days that followed, was what happened at the lake house itself. Rosalind Averill was the first to knock on Hannah's door uninvited, not to gossip this time, but to apologize, awkwardly and at length, for years of assumptions she'd never once tested against the truth. Others followed in smaller ways. A plate of cookies left on the porch, a wave held a beat longer than necessary at the grocery store, Earl himself finally managing, weeks later, a mumbled acknowledgement that he'd maybe spoken out of turn. But it was Luke who Hannah turned to first, that same night after the benefit, standing at her gate under a sky finally clearing after a long gray week. She didn't thank him for defending her, because he hadn't needed to. That was the part she seemed to still be absorbing, that his steadiness beside her over the winter had never once required speeches or public declarations. Only the plain fact of showing up, again and again, regardless of what the town whispered. "You knew," she said to him quietly, "and you stayed anyway, before any of them apologized, before Marisol said anything in that gym. You already knew who I was." Luke, never a man for long speeches, only told her that he'd spent years inspecting buildings other people had already condemned, and that most of the time, what looked structurally unsound from the outside was just old and tired, and had never once actually failed to hold weight. It wasn't a declaration, but it landed like one. 3 weeks later, an evening neither of them fully anticipated would arrive faster than expected. The night the whole of Millbrook Hollow would gather again, this time not for a benefit, but for something closer to a reckoning, and the night Hannah Reynolds would finally have to decide, in front of everyone, whether to let herself be fully seen. The town meeting hall in Millbrook Hollow hadn't been full like this in years, but word travels fast in a place this small, and when Rosalind Averill organized a modest spring gathering, nominally to thank the volunteers from the benefit, but understood by nearly everyone attending as something closer to a public reckoning, almost the entire town showed up, Earl included, sitting near the back with his hat in his hands. Hannah nearly didn't come. Luke found her at the lake house an hour before, standing at the window with her coat already on and her hand still on the doorknob, unmoved, and he didn't push her, didn't argue her into it. He only told her that Chloe had made her a card that morning, unprompted, and that it was sitting on the kitchen table if she wanted to bring it, and then he waited, quietly, the way he'd learned to wait for things that mattered, until she picked it up herself and walked out to the truck. Rosalind spoke first when the room settled, her voice steadier than it had been on the gymnasium floor weeks earlier, thanking Hannah plainly, without embellishment, for saving her son's life, and then saying the harder thing too, that the town owed Hannah more than gratitude for one afternoon, that it owed her 4 years of apology for a story it had told about her, without ever once asking if it was true. Others spoke after her, briefer, less polished, but sincere. Earl stood last, said very little, but said it looking directly at Hannah, which for a man like Earl was its own form of full confession. There was a moment, near the end, when the town's mayor, meaning well, in the way well-meaning small-town officials often do, offered Hannah a formal position on the town's health advisory board, a modest honor, a plaque, a public gesture large enough to be seen from every angle. Hannah thanked him and declined it, gently, and asked instead for something smaller and stranger to the room. A standing arrangement, quiet and unofficial, to be listed as the town's emergency medical contact for exactly the kind of moment that had happened at the benefit. Not a title, not a ceremony, just the simple, structural fact of being someone Millbrook Hollow could call on again, the way it should have been able to all along. The meeting ended not with applause, but with something quieter. People lingering, approaching Hannah in twos and threes, an easiness in the room that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. The real ending, though, came weeks later, in June, on an ordinary Tuesday evening with nothing ceremonial about it at all. Luke and Chloe were at the lake house, as they were most Tuesdays now. Chloe cross-legged on the porch floor, finishing a painting of the lake at sunset while Hannah watched over her shoulder, offering small corrections to a shadow here, a highlight there. On the side table inside, visible now through the open door, the photograph that had sat face down for years was finally turned upright. Hannah and Mara, younger, laughing, unposed. The frame no longer something to hide, but something to simply have in the room again. Luke sat on the porch steps beside Hannah while Chloe painted, and it was Hannah who spoke first, quietly, watching the child's careful brushstrokes. "I used to think being needed and being loved were the same thing," she said. "That I only mattered as long as I was fixing something. I don't think that anymore." Luke didn't answer with anything clever. He only reached over, took her hand, and let the silence between them hold the rest of what neither of them needed to say aloud yet. If there's one thing this story asks of you, it's this. Think of the person in your own life that others have warned you away from, the one whose story got decided before anyone bothered asking them directly. So often the people we're told to fear are only the ones who've been carrying something too heavy to explain, waiting for someone patient enough to knock twice instead of walking away after the first warning. If you believe quiet, overlooked people deserve to be truly seen, we'd love to have you stay part of this story with us. Subscribe if that's the kind of story you want more of, and we'll keep bringing them to you. And if this one moved you, we'd truly love to know. Stay a moment longer, because the final truth of where Luke and Hannah's story goes next is still waiting for you.